course.
Morning. Are you hopeful that the Senate is going to get anything done today?
No. They have proven.
Tell us how you really feel.
Well, they're now revisiting and relitigating this whole idea that they're going to, have a concept of a plan on health care when Democrats are saying just put the subsidies in place to keep insurance rates low. I would love for them to open up government. Your earlier guest, Jason Crow, I haven't seen that guy in like 50 days. I had to come to the studio to see him. I wouldn't recognize Mike Johnson if he was in front of me at the checkout line in the supermarket because just not going in. We probably should put his job on LinkedIn. So Congress needs to show up and work. This is the first time in any shutdown that I've seen where both chambers are not there every single day. That's what typically forces a deal. Mm-hmm. We should be in Congress every day to get back to work.
Are any of those concepts of a plan potential off-ramps?
No, because the off-ramp is to just put the subsidies in place that have been there every year that keep insurance plans low. But as you said at the top.
Okay, so House Speaker Mike Johnson just got absolutely destroyed in court, and now his own party is turning on him in the most brutal way possible. A federal judge just handed Johnson a devastating, humiliating defeat in a high-profile lawsuit, and the MAGA base is absolutely furious about how it all went down. Here's what happened. Johnson refused to seat duly elected Arizona Democrat Adelita Grijalva using procedural excuses during a government shutdown to block her from taking her rightful place in Congress. The Arizona Attorney General sued, and a federal judge didn't just rule against Johnson, they eviscerated him. The judge called Johnson's position constitutionally indefensible. They said his legal arguments were baseless and thrown together. They ordered immediate seating of Grijalva and made clear that Arizona's voters had been denied their voice in Congress by Johnson's partisan games. And here's the thing. The judge fast-tracked this ruling because they recognized that every single day Grijalva wasn't seated was a day her constituents went without representation. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
He has Republican friends.
He has the votes. And first, Mike Fabrizio, if you really want to go in the weeds here, is a Trump pollster. He has circulated a memo to House Republicans that has told them, you're going to get creamed if you don't put these subsidies back in place. So they
talked about that poll before that actually came out during Trump's campaign.
Right. Yeah, so they know that this is a problem for them. We also know that Mike Johnson has it in him to put up a vote where a majority of his caucus votes against it, but it's the right thing. We saw him do this in the last Congress to keep government open. We saw him do this with the Ukraine funding. So what's changed? Donald Trump is president. And so you feel like maybe he just doesn't have the decision-making ability to do this without Trump signing off. But we know he's able to do it. And I know that the votes are there because they've seen the warning signs that this is a real problem for them in the midterms.
This wasn't some minor procedural setback that Johnson can spin away. This was a total legal collapse that exposed the GOP strategy as nothing more than partisan obstruction, dressed up in legal language. The judge saw right through it and didn't waste any time telling the world exactly what was going on. Can you believe this? The Speaker of the House tried to block a duly elected member of Congress from being seated, got sued, lost spectacularly, and now his own base is calling him weak and demanding his head. The MAGA reaction has been absolutely brutal. Right-wing leaders and pundits are erupting in anger, accusing Johnson of weakness and betrayal. They wanted him to fight to the bitter end, to use every possible tactic to keep Grijalva out of Congress, regardless of what any court said. They didn't care about the legal merits. They wanted Johnson to be a warrior who never backs down, never surrenders, never admits defeat. Instead, they got a speaker who launched a legally doomed strategy, lost embarrassingly in court, and now has to comply with the judge's order to seat a Democrat. The fury from the MAGA base is palpable. Social media is full of attacks on Johnson, calling him a sellout, a weakling, a Reno who doesn't have the spine to fight for conservative principles. They're demanding new leadership in the House, threatening primary challenges against Johnson and anyone who supported this failed strategy. The very base Johnson needs to keep his speakership is turning against him in the most public and humiliating way possible. But here's the irony that makes this whole situation so wild. Legal experts have been warning for weeks that Johnson's strategy to block Grijalva was legally indefensible. The Constitution is clear about who gets seated in Congress. It's the people who win elections in their districts. The Speaker doesn't get to override election results because of procedural technicalities or because seating a Democrat is politically inconvenient. Any serious legal challenge was going to expose this strategy as the partisan nonsense it always was. Johnson knew this, or he should have known it. He pursued this strategy anyway, probably hoping to delay long enough to get some political benefit or to satisfy the MAGA base's demands for aggressive action. Instead, he got the worst of both worlds, a humiliating legal defeat that satisfies nobody and makes him look incompetent and weak. The judge's ruling was particularly devastating in its language and reasoning. They didn't just say Johnson was wrong on the technical legal issues. They said his position was constitutionally indefensible, meaning there was no reasonable legal argument for what he was doing. They recognized that denying Grijalva her seat was causing constitutional harm to her constituents that required urgent remedy. They fast-tracked the ruling specifically because every day of delay was another day Arizona voters went without their chosen representative in Congress. This ruling sets a powerful precedent for the future. Any speaker who tries similar tactics to block duly elected members will face immediate legal challenge with this case as precedent. Courts have now made clear that partisan seat blocking won't be tolerated and will face instant rejection. The legal foundation for representative rights has been strengthened, and future attempts at these games will be even harder to sustain. The political implications for Johnson are severe and potentially career-ending. He's already facing a narrow majority in the House that makes his speakership precarious. Now he's got the MAGA base openly revolting against him, moderate Republicans embarrassed by the legal defeat, and Democrats energized by a clear win that exposed GOP tactics as unconstitutional obstruction. The coalition Johnson needs to hold together is fracturing in real time, and this lawsuit defeat is accelerating that fragmentation dramatically. Republican infighting was already bad before this ruling. Now it's about to get much worse. We're seeing the beginnings of leadership challenges, primary threats, and open warfare between MAGA hardliners who wanted more aggressive tactics and establishment Republicans who are tired of losing embarrassing legal battles. The 2026 midterms are approaching, and Republicans are heading into that election cycle, divided, demoralized, and led by a speaker who just got publicly humiliated in federal court. So we're going to break down exactly what happened in this lawsuit, why Johnson's strategy was doomed from the start, what the MAGA reaction tells us about the state of the Republican Party, and what this means for congressional politics going forward. This is the kind of defeat that reshapes party dynamics and exposes fundamental weaknesses in how Republicans have been operating. Trust me, you're going to want to understand every detail of this disaster. All right, let's dig into the details of this lawsuit disaster, because understanding the specifics reveals just how badly Johnson miscalculated and why the MAGA reaction is so furious. We need to start with what actually happened to trigger this legal battle in the first place. Adelita Grijalva won her election in Arizona fair and square. The voters of her district chose her to represent them in Congress. Under normal circumstances, winning an election means you get seated in Congress. That's how democracy works in America. But Mike Johnson decided to play games with the process. He refused to seat Grijalva, citing procedural issues related to a government shutdown. The excuses were thin and transparently partisan. Johnson was trying to keep a Democrat out of Congress for as long as possible, hoping to maintain every possible Republican advantage in a narrowly divided House. The Arizona Attorney General saw what was happening and decided to fight back through the courts. They filed a lawsuit arguing that Johnson's refusal to seat Grijalva was unconstitutional, that Arizona voters were being denied their chosen representative through partisan obstruction. The legal arguments were straightforward. The Constitution establishes how members of Congress are chosen, and it's through elections in their districts. The Speaker doesn't have authority to override election results or indefinitely delay seating members because of manufactured procedural concerns. What Johnson was doing had no constitutional basis and was causing real harm to Arizona voters every day. It continued without their representative in Congress. Johnson's legal team tried to defend his position, but their arguments were weak from the start. They relied on procedural technicalities and claims about the Speaker's authority that didn't hold up under serious legal scrutiny. Any constitutional law expert could have told them this strategy would fail in court, and many did warn them publicly before the ruling came down. But Johnson proceeded anyway, either because he thought he could delay long enough to get some political benefit, or because he was afraid of the MAGA backlash if he didn't at least try to block the Democrat. The federal judge's ruling was swift and devastating in its scope and language. They fast-tracked the case because they recognized that constitutional harm was occurring every single day. Grijalva wasn't seated. This wasn't a situation where the court could take its time and carefully consider complex legal questions over months of deliberation. Arizona voters were being denied representation in Congress right now, and that required urgent judicial action to remedy immediately. The judge's language was unusually harsh and direct for a federal court ruling. They called Johnson's position constitutionally indefensible. Not just wrong, not just misguided, but completely without constitutional foundation. They said his legal arguments were baseless and would have been thrown out of any serious court immediately. They made clear that what Johnson was doing amounted to partisan obstruction, dressed up in procedural language, and they weren't going to let it stand for another day. The order for immediate seating of Grijalva left Johnson with no room to maneuver or delay further. He had to comply with the court's ruling and seat the Democrat he'd been fighting to block. all the political theater, all the procedural games, all the tough talk about fighting for conservative principles, it all collapsed into an embarrassing defeat that Johnson couldn't spin or escape from. The ruling also sets important legal precedent for future congressional disputes of this nature. Courts have now made clear that speakers cannot use procedural excuses to block duly elected members from taking their seats in Congress. Future attempts at this kind of partisan seat blocking will face immediate legal challenge, with this case as precedent, showing how courts will rule. The legal foundation for representative rights has been strengthened significantly by this decision. Now let's talk about the MAGA reaction, because this is where things get really interesting and revealing about the state of the Republican Party. You might think MAGA leaders would be upset at the judge for ruling against Johnson, directing their anger at the judicial system they love to criticize anyway, but that's not what happened at all. Instead, the fury is directed squarely at Johnson himself. The MAGA base wanted Johnson to fight to the bitter end, regardless of what any court said about the legality of his position. They wanted him to be a warrior who never backs down, who uses every possible tactic, who treats politics as total war, where surrender is never an option. They didn't care that the legal strategy was doomed from the start. They didn't care that constitutional law experts had been warning for weeks that Johnson would lose badly in court. They wanted the fight itself, the spectacle of resistance, the demonstration that their leaders would go to any lengths to oppose Democrats. Johnson gave them a half-hearted fight that collapsed embarrassingly at the first serious legal challenge. From the MAGA perspective, that's worse than not fighting at all. It makes their movement look weak and incompetent. It shows that their aggressive tactics can't survive contact with actual judicial scrutiny. It suggests that all the tough talk about fighting the system is just performance when real legal consequences are on the line. The attacks on Johnson from right-wing media and MAGA leaders have been brutal and relentless. They're calling him a sellout who doesn't have the courage to fight for conservative principles when things get difficult. They're calling him a weakling who folds under pressure instead of standing firm on principle. They're calling him a Reno Republican in name only, the ultimate insult in MAGA circles that suggests someone isn't really committed to the cause. These attacks are significant because they come from the very base Johnson needs to maintain his speakership. The House Republican majority is narrow enough that Johnson can't afford to lose significant support from any faction of his caucus. If MAGA members decide he's too weak to lead, they can make his life miserable through procedural votes, threaten his speakership directly, or simply refuse to cooperate on legislative priorities he needs to pass. The irony of the MAGA reaction is that their preferred strategy, fighting to the end regardless of legal merit, would have resulted in even worse outcomes for their cause. If Johnson had defied the court order and refused to seek revolver, he would have faced contempt charges, potential arrest, and a constitutional crisis that would have made Republicans look like authoritarian extremists willing to override democracy itself. The legal strategy was always going to fail because there was no constitutional basis for blocking a duly elected member of Congress. The only question was whether Republicans would lose gracefully or lose catastrophically. Johnson chose to lose gracefully, and the MAGA base is punishing him for it because they would have preferred the catastrophic option that at least looked like fighting. This dynamic reveals a fundamental problem in the Republican Party right now. The base demands aggressive, uncompromising tactics that often have no legal or constitutional foundation whatsoever. When those tactics inevitably fail in court or create political backlash, leaders like Johnson get blamed for not fighting hard enough, even though fighting harder would have made things even worse. It's a no-win situation that's causing Republican leaders to pursue increasingly extreme strategies just to satisfy base demands, then getting punished when those strategies collapse under legal or political scrutiny. The infighting this has triggered is severe and could reshape House Republican politics heading into 2026. We're already seeing talk of leadership challenges against Johnson. Primary threats are being made against Republicans who supported the failed strategy or who aren't sufficiently angry about the outcome. The fragile coalition Johnson has been holding together is fracturing along familiar fault lines between MAGA hardliners and establishment Republicans. Some Republicans are privately relieved that the court forced Johnson to seek revolver because it gets them out of an untenable political position. They knew the strategy was going to fail and were uncomfortable with blocking a duly elected member of Congress anyway. But they couldn't say that publicly without facing MAGA backlash. The court ruling gives them cover to move on without having to admit they thought the strategy was wrong from the beginning. Democrats, meanwhile, are enjoying every moment of this Republican disaster. They get their members seated in Congress. They get to watch Republicans tear each other apart over the defeat. They get powerful messaging about GOP tactics being ruled unconstitutional and indefensible by a federal judge. And they get precedent that will make future seat-blocking attempts even harder for Republicans to pursue successfully. Okay, let's break this down into clear points so everyone understands exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it means for Republican politics going forward into the 2026 elections and beyond. Point number 1, Johnson's legal strategy was doomed from the start, and any competent constitutional lawyer could have told him that before he even tried. The Constitution is crystal clear about who gets seated in Congress. It's the people who win elections in their districts through the democratic process. The Speaker has certain procedural authorities, but overriding election results isn't one of them. Under any reading of constitutional law, Johnson tried to manufacture procedural excuses using the government shutdown, but those excuses were transparent nonsense that no serious court was ever going to accept as legitimate. Legal experts warned publicly for weeks that this strategy would fail spectacularly in court. The only question was how badly and how quickly the defeat would come. Johnson proceeded anyway, presumably hoping to delay long enough to get some political benefit or to satisfy MAGA demands for aggressive action against Democrats. Instead, he got a fast-track ruling that called his position constitutionally indefensible and ordered immediate compliance with the court's decision. There was no graceful exit, no face-saving compromise, just total legal humiliation on a very public stage. Point number 2. The judge's ruling was unusually harsh and creates strong precedent against future seat-blocking attempts by partisan speakers. Federal judges typically use measured language, even when ruling against parties, maintaining judicial decorum and avoiding unnecessary or inflammatory statements in their opinions. This judge abandoned that restraint and called Johnson's position exactly what it was: constitutionally indefensible, baseless, and harmful to Arizona voters who deserve representation in Congress. The fast-tracking of the case sent its own message about how courts view these tactics. By treating the denial of Grijalva's seat as a constitutional harm requiring urgent remedy, the judge established that future seat-blocking attempts will face immediate judicial intervention rather than months of leisurely deliberation. This precedent strengthens the legal foundation for representative rights and makes similar tactics much riskier for any speaker to attempt going forward. Point number 3. The MAGA reaction reveals a fundamental dysfunction in Republican Party politics that has no easy solution for leadership. The base demands aggressive, uncompromising tactics, regardless of legal merit or political consequences in the real world. When those tactics fail, as they inevitably must when they lack constitutional foundation, leaders get blamed for not fighting hard enough, even when fighting harder would have made outcomes even worse. This creates a no-win dynamic for Republican leaders like Johnson. If he hadn't tried to block Grijalva, MAGA would have attacked him for surrendering without a fight and being too weak to lead. Because he tried and lost, MAGA is attacking him for being weak and incompetent for losing the fight they demanded he start. The only way to satisfy the base would be to win unwinnable battles, which is impossible by definition when the legal and constitutional foundations aren't there to support aggressive tactics. Johnson is stuck between a base that demands impossible victories and political realities that punish overreach. Point number 4. Republican infighting triggered by this defeat could reshape House politics heading into 2026 and beyond. The fragile coalition Johnson has been holding together was already under strain before this ruling came down from the federal court. Now we're seeing open warfare between MAGA hardliners who wanted more aggressive tactics and establishment Republicans who are tired of losing embarrassing legal battles that make the party look extreme and incompetent. Leadership challenges are being discussed openly in Republican circles. Primary threats are being made against members who aren't sufficiently outraged about the defeat. The party is fracturing along fault lines that have been building for years but are now breaking open in ways that will be very difficult to repair before voters go to the polls. Some Republicans are privately relieved that the court forced this outcome because it gets them out of an untenable position they never wanted to be in. They knew blocking a duly elected member of Congress was wrong and legally indefensible from the beginning, but they couldn't say that publicly without facing MAGA backlash and being labeled traitors to the cause. The court ruling gives them cover to move on without having to openly break with their base. Point number 5. Democrats benefit enormously from this Republican disaster in multiple ways that will help them heading into the midterms. Grijalva gets seated in Congress, giving Democrats another vote in a narrowly divided House where every single seat matters for legislative outcomes. They get powerful messaging about GOP tactics being ruled unconstitutional by a federal judge. That's the kind of attack ad material that practically writes itself for campaign season. They get to watch Republicans tear each other apart over recriminations and blame shifting while projecting unity on their own side, and they get precedent that will make future seat blocking attempts even harder for Republicans to pursue successfully against Democratic members. The contrast between parties couldn't be clearer right now. Democrats are unified in winning legal battles that protect Democratic representation and voting rights. Republicans are divided, losing legal battles and attacking each other over who's to blame for the defeats they keep suffering. That's not a good look heading into an election cycle where Republicans need to win back voters they've been losing in recent elections. Point number 6. This defeat exposes a key weakness in MAGA legal strategy that will affect future battles beyond just this case. MAGA tactics often rely on aggressive posturing and procedural games that fall apart under serious legal scrutiny in actual courts. They work as political theater and base energizing spectacle, but they don't hold up when judges apply actual constitutional law to the situations. This case demonstrated that weakness in the most public way possible. Johnson pursued an aggressive strategy that had no legal foundation, got it thrown out of court in humiliating fashion, and now faces backlash from the very base that demanded the strategy in the first place. Future MAGA legal battles will face similar problems because the underlying approach prioritizes political theater over legal substance and constitutional grounding. Courts aren't impressed by tough talk and aggressive posturing. They apply the law, and when your legal arguments are baseless, you lose badly and publicly. So where does this leave us right now? Mike Johnson is severely weakened as Speaker, facing revolt from his MAGA base and embarrassment among establishment Republicans who are tired of losing these kinds of battles. The Republican Party is more divided than ever, with infighting that will only intensify as the 2026 midterms approach and candidates position themselves for primary battles and general elections. Democrats have won a significant victory that seats their member, sets helpful precedent, and provides powerful campaign messaging about Republican extremism and constitutional violations. And the legal system has demonstrated that it will defend representative democracy against partisan obstruction, regardless of which party attempts it. The broader lesson here is that aggressive tactics without legal foundation eventually collapse when they face real judicial scrutiny from actual courts. MAGA may demand that leaders fight to the end, regardless of merit, but courts don't care about political theater or base demands. They care about the law and the Constitution. When your position is constitutionally indefensible, no amount of tough talk or aggressive posturing will save you from defeat in a courtroom. Johnson learned that lesson the hard way, and he's paying a severe political price for it from all sides. His base is furious he lost. His establishment allies are embarrassed he tried something so legally weak, and his opponents are energized by his very public humiliation on the national stage. This is what happens when political strategy prioritizes base satisfaction over legal reality and constitutional grounding. The defeat was predictable and predicted by experts. The MAGA backlash was predictable given base dynamics. The Republican infighting was predictable given existing tensions within the party coalition. Everything about this disaster was foreseeable, and Johnson walked into it anyway because he was more afraid of MAGA backlash for not trying than he was of the consequences of trying and failing badly. That calculation turned out to be wrong, and now he's facing consequences from all directions simultaneously. Keep watching the story because the fallout is just beginning, and the 2026 implications are enormous. Are you kidding me? This is what happens when political theater meets constitutional reality in a federal courtroom.